The International Space Station has an incredibly advanced life support and environmental control system. Without these vital systems working in concert, the astronauts would be turned into blood-boiled, brain-dead space sickles. Each of these systems took thousands of highly trained engineers decades to conceive, design, build, test, and refine. Despite the billions of dollars, millions of hours, and thousands of engineers, it can only support a few people for a limited amount of time. It must be constantly resupplied with resources from Earth, and you have to pee into a really embarrassing tube apparatus harnessed to your umbilicals. As if that's not enough, everyone inside is bathed in bone-bleaching space radiation. There is a much more advanced machine that has all of the life support systems mentioned above and many more. It is a massive space station which can support billions of humans, guard them against the life-crushing, breath-depriving, radioactive sterilizing horrors of space. It offers conditions not only for survival, but the full scope of human experience. It is sustainable and self-sufficient. It's been running with precision for millennia. It's called Earth. No one, other than the flat Earth geniuses, would deny that it has taken thousands of engineers centuries to develop the joint technology that makes the International Space Station work. However, there are some that still claim that Earth, the greatest and most reliable spacecraft we have ever seen, needed no engineer, no designer, and no creator. Regardless of your religious beliefs, if there is a planet like Earth, there must be an engineer.
Let's see if life-sustaining planets truly are likely. The galaxy is huge, about 100 billion stars. That's 100,000 millions. A star has to be in the right part of the galaxy to host life. It can't be too close to the center because of the bone-bleaching X-ray and flesh-melting radiation levels. However, it can't be too far out because the heavy elements needed for life are out of stock way yonder in the boondocks. So, 99.7% of stars can't support life. We've narrowed that original 100 billion down to 300 million stars. You need a stable star with a reliable astrosphere and ultraviolet qualities that you can take home and introduce to your parents. Unless you want to turn all living things into a thermo-mutant toxic sludge, only a yellow dwarf star in its main sequence will do. All other stars are deadbeats and planet beaters. This eliminates 96% of stars as candidates with which life can fall in love, settle down, and start a family. We now have 12 million stars. There must be planets around the star, and they must be the right distance away. Like in-laws, not too close on date night, but not too far away when the kids are driving you nuts. 80% of discovered planets won't support life because of their distance from their host star. This 80% subtracts the number to 2.4 million planets to look at as possible candidates for habitability. Tidal locking eliminates 28%, planet size another 83%, and axis tilt another 64%. If any of these are off by a little, they will kill all biological life in ways that even Jack the Ripper would disapprove of. This brings the pool of possible life-sustaining planets down to about 100,000. But we're not done yet. Elliptical orbits, electric wind, and long rotation rates make biological life less likely than an Elvis comeback tour. These criteria shave our number of possible planets down to about 4,000. We must account for the right orbital length, livable atmospheric composition, plate tectonics, and the need for large outer planets. Having the wrong amounts of any of these would be more deadly than skinny dipping in a lava pool. After all these criteria, we are left with a very small number of available planets. What's the number? 0.7 planets. Outside of the half-finished Death Star, planets generally come in quantities of 1 or more. The 15 criteria that we've looked at so far have statistically eliminated the chance that life could randomly occur in a galaxy the size of the Milky Way. But wait, we've only considered 15 criteria. We still have hundreds to go. Water availability, atmospheric pressure, nutrients, rocky composition, orbital bodies, binary star systems, the rarity of an ozone layer, the unknowns concerning abiogenesis, and about a million other things. Even though we have 100 billion, there are not nearly enough stars in the Milky Way galaxy to make randomly occurring life anywhere near plausible. The more we learn from science, the more we see that this world is incredibly, impossibly, indubitably unlikely. Maybe, just maybe, life-sustaining planets aren't random at all. Atheists often claim that there is no evidence that the God of the Bible exists. However, the Bible is full of statements that are verifiable in the modern world. In Genesis 17, for example, God makes an agreement with the Jews that He says will last forever. If the Jews cease to exist, it would cast doubt on God's existence. Virtually all ancient people groups disappeared by being assimilated into new cultures. The Etruscans, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the list goes on and on. They've all disappeared. They've all disappeared except the Jews. Despite all odds, they continue to exist. So far, Genesis 17 is verified. Around the year 30 AD, Jesus made at least 5 verifiable statements about the future of the Jews recorded in Luke 21. He predicted that Jerusalem would be destroyed. In 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed. So this prediction of Jesus was verified. 2. Jews would be dispersed, Jesus predicted. The Jewish people were forced out and prevented from returning to their homeland from 70 AD until 1989. So this prediction of Jesus was historically verified. Number 3, Jews would be brutalized everywhere they went, Jesus predicted. The Jews endured countless persecutions throughout the last 2,000 years. The best known are the pogroms in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the Holocaust in the 30s and the 40s. So this prediction of Jesus is also verified by history. Number 4, Jesus predicted that Jerusalem would be controlled by Gentiles. Jerusalem was controlled by Gentile rulers for 1,878 years. Here are a few of them: Roman, Byzantine, Persian, Arab, Crusaders, Mamluk, Ottoman, British. So this prediction of Jesus is also historically verified. And number 5, the most impossible, Jews would someday regain control of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was beaten in 70 AD and ultimately lost in 136 AD, but in 1967, Jerusalem was brought back under Jewish control. This impossible prediction of Jesus's is verified by history. Deuteronomy 4 says that the Jews would stay small in number during the time that they are away from the land of Israel. From 200 to 1800 AD, world population grew from 170 million to near 1 billion. Despite this incredible growth, Jewish population stayed around 1 million for 1,600 years. Jewish population should have grown by a factor of 5, but instead, they remained small in number, just as Deuteronomy 4 predicted. This trend continued until the Jews began to return to Israel, which was also predicted. In Deuteronomy 30, it says that once the people have returned to the land of Israel, they would become more numerous than their forefathers. In the century before the modern state of Israel was established, the Jewish population began to skyrocket.
Now that there is a Jewish homeland, there are more Jews living there and in the world than there have ever been in all of history. This is exactly what Deuteronomy 30 predicted. In Genesis 12, God promises that all people on earth will be blessed through the Jews. One way that Jews have blessed the world is through their inventions and discoveries. Inventions by Jews include the pacemaker, the defibrillator, genetic engineering, stainless steel, lasers, E=mc², the cholera, bubonic plague, and polio vaccines, nuclear energy, Google, the flash drive, drip irrigation, and thousands more. Jews only make up 0.02% of the world population, but have won 20% of the Nobel Prizes. They have blessed the world just as Genesis 12 predicted. There are hundreds of these types of verifiable statements in the Bible, such as Amos 9 says the ruins of Israel would be rebuilt. This started in 1882. Now the nation ranks in the top 8% of the world on the Human Development Index. Ezekiel 36 says that the prosperity of Israel would return. Israel's GDP per capita now ranks in the top 11% of the world. Isaiah 41 says trees would grow in Israel once more. In 1867, Mark Twain called Israel a silent, mournful expanse. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. However, the Jewish National Fund estimates that now 240 million trees have been planted in Israel since 1901. Isaiah 51 said their deserts would become lush. What was once desert is now high-production farmland through the use of precision agriculture and advanced technology. Isaiah 27 says Israel's fruit would fill the world, which wasn't even technologically possible when it was written thousands of years ago. Israel not only exports fruits and flowers all over the world today, but the Israeli-developed technology to grow these are being used almost everywhere modern agriculture is happening. So, to claim that there is no evidence that the God of the Bible exists is really quite ridiculous. In Luke 21:24, Jesus reveals they will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time the Gentiles are fulfilled. So number one, here Jesus is predicting Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed. Number two, he's predicting Jews would be killed and taken away as prisoners. Number three, he's predicting that the Jews would survive. Number four, he's predicting that non-Jews would control Jerusalem for a time. And then number five, he's predicting that at some point Jews would once again gain control. So let's talk about number one. Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed. I've had atheist opponents who have said that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple were an obvious, almost foredrawn conclusion. They claim that Rome was in the habit of destroying cities. On the contrary, Rome was an empire of builders. There were times when Rome destroyed cities, think of Carthage, but generally it was because that city represented another military power that challenged Rome's authority. By and large, Rome preferred to leave cities intact. There are obvious reasons for this. A destroyed city is a city stricken with poverty. If Rome could preserve a city and bring it under control, then taxes and tribute could be collected. Very little taxes came from burning heaps of rubble, as you can imagine. In fact, Titus, the commander of the Roman forces during the Jewish war, wanted to preserve the Jewish temple. He claimed that his army burned the temple against his wishes. So Jerusalem being destroyed and the temple was not a foredrawn conclusion. Number two, Jesus predicted that Jews would be killed and taken away as prisoners. In a similar manner, I've had atheists claim that Rome was in the habit of banishing and exiling people from the lands that they were conquered. This is wrong on two counts. Rome was in the habit of killing rebels, taking prisoners, selling slaves, but they didn't often exile people groups. In the various Jewish wars and revolts, Rome killed hundreds of thousands of Jews at the destruction of the nation. Many more died of hunger. Titus took some Jewish prisoners to Rome and sold some Jews as slaves in Libya. However, Josephus, who is our best source on the subject, doesn't say anything about exile or banishment. Centuries later, there were bans on Jews entering the city of Jerusalem, but even still, there have been small numbers of Jews living in Jerusalem for the last 3,300 years. This matters because Jerusalem is its people. Rome renamed the city Capitolonia after its destruction, and it became a pagan city. However, the small number of Jews that remained were trampled by Gentiles for nearly 2,000 years. Number 3, Jesus predicted the Jews would survive. I've had atheist opponents who claim that this is not all that surprising. However, think about this. Virtually all ancient ethnicities disappear by way of assimilation. Where are the Etruscans, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, even the Romans no longer exist. They all have been assimilated into whatever culture was around them. Generally, this happens when their homeland disappears. When a people group no longer has a homeland or a region to occupy, they get assimilated. It's happened thousands of times throughout history. Homeless people groups don't retain their distinctiveness, but eventually they disappear. That is true of virtually all ancient ethnicities except the Jews. Now add on top of that the fact that the Jews have been expelled from virtually every country they have taken up residence in. They have been persecuted everywhere they've gone. The Jews are the only people to have a distinct word for the mistreatment that they've experienced, anti-Semitism. They have remained around a population of 1 million for 1,600 years. Hitler killed 6 million of them, which was a big percentage of their population at the time. The only way most persecuted people survive is by having a large enough population to absorb the destruction. The Jews have been small in number for most of their existence, and yet they have still survived. They've had attempts at genocide, and yet they survived. So, nonetheless, all of these things, Jesus predicted it, and it's come true. Number 4, non-Jews would control Jerusalem for a time. This is exactly what happened. Jerusalem was controlled by Gentile rulers for 1,887 years. So Jerusalem was trampled by the Gentiles. Romans, Byzantine, Persian, Arab, Crusaders, Mamluk, Ottoman, and the British rulers all controlled the land at various times. And number 5, Jesus predicted that at some point Jews would once again gain control of Jerusalem. He said, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, so basically he's saying, at the point when Jerusalem is no longer controlled by Gentiles, the time of the Gentiles is over. Now that seems a little redundant, but there's something important in it. It predicts a few things. It predicts that the Jews would regain some national cohesion. It predicts that they would grow in military power enough to retake the city. This was considered an impossible task. How could Jews ever retake Jerusalem without a military to do it? How could Jews have a military if they didn't have a homeland? How could Jews have a nation if they didn't have Jerusalem? For many years, this verse was viewed as possibly allegorical or was somehow going to be fulfilled when Jesus returned. However, in 1948, the nation of Israel was reestablished. However, the nation boundaries didn't include most of Jerusalem. For a number of years, Israel grew. In 1967, Israel took back Jerusalem from the Gentiles. If you haven't read accounts of the Six-Day War, you should. Many who fought in it described the happenings as unexplained and even miraculous. Whatever the case may be, Jesus predicted that it would happen, and it happened. Take note that none of these things are vague, and they describe very unlikely events. Nonetheless, Jesus predicted it, and it came true.